Part 1: An ordinary day before the apocalypse. Some disasters arrive with warning. Others strike without mercy. Chernobyl was one of them. Imagine going to sleep, believing tomorrow would be just another ordinary Saturday. Children were dreaming about weekend adventures. Parents were planning family trips. Workers prepared for another routine shift. Across the quiet Soviet city of Pripyat, life felt peaceful. The streets were calm, apartment lights slowly disappeared one by one, and nothing suggested that history was about to change forever. Just a few hundred meters away stood one of the Soviet Union's greatest technological achievements, the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. It was a symbol of progress, power, and the future. No one knew that within hours, Reactor No. 4 would explode with a force no one believed possible. The blast would send radioactive material thousands of meters into the atmosphere. An invisible cloud would spread across Europe. Entire cities would be abandoned. Hundreds of thousands of people would lose their homes. And the world would witness the worst nuclear disaster in human history. This is the story of Chernobyl. To understand how everything went so terribly wrong, we first need to travel back several years. The Soviet Union was determined to become the world's leading industrial superpower. Electricity was essential for factories, military production, and rapidly growing cities. Nuclear power seemed like the perfect answer. Unlike coal or oil, nuclear reactors could generate enormous amounts of electricity while using relatively little fuel. The Soviet government invested heavily in building nuclear power stations across the country. One of the largest projects was constructed near the small Ukrainian village of Chernobyl, about 130 kilometers north of Kyiv. Despite its name, the power plant was not located inside the town of Chernobyl itself. Instead, it stood beside a brand new city built specifically for its workers. That city was called Pripyat. Founded in 1970, Pripyat represented the ideal Soviet future. Wide streets, modern apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, parks, a cultural center, swimming pools, sports facilities, everything a young family could dream of. The average age of its residents was only around 26 years old. Nearly 50,000 people lived there. Most of them worked at the nuclear power plant or supported its daily operations. To many citizens of the Soviet Union, Pripyat was one of the best places to live. Jobs were stable. Education was excellent. The city was clean and modern. Few people imagined that it would eventually become one of the world's most famous ghost cities. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself was considered a masterpiece of engineering. It used a reactor design known as the RBMK. The letters stood for High Power Channel Type Reactor. These reactors were capable of producing enormous amounts of electricity. They also allowed the Soviet Union to produce materials useful for military purposes. On paper, they seemed incredibly efficient. But hidden beneath that impressive design were dangerous flaws. Some engineers had already expressed concerns. Certain operating conditions could make the reactor unstable. There were also weaknesses in the emergency shutdown system. Instead of openly discussing these problems, many officials chose silence. Inside the Soviet system, admitting flaws could damage careers. Success was celebrated, failure was often hidden. As a result, many operators believed the reactors were much safer than they actually were. That false confidence would have devastating consequences. By April 1986, Reactor No. 4 had been operating for several years. The reactor was scheduled for routine maintenance. Before shutting it down, engineers wanted to perform an important safety test. The purpose of the experiment sounded simple. If the power station suddenly lost electricity, could the spinning turbines continue generating enough power for about 40 seconds until emergency diesel generators started? Those 40 seconds were critical. Without electricity, cooling systems might fail. The test had been attempted before but never successfully completed. This time, engineers hoped everything would finally work. On the evening of April 25, preparations began. Power output was slowly reduced. Operators carefully monitored dozens of control panels filled with buttons, switches, gauges, and warning lights. Everything appeared normal, but then something unexpected happened. Officials responsible for the regional power grid requested that the reactor continue supplying electricity longer than planned because demand remained high. The test had to be delayed. The reactor stayed at reduced power for several more hours. That delay changed everything. By the time permission was finally given to continue, the experienced daytime crew had gone home. A different team, working the night shift, inherited a reactor operating in unusual conditions. Many of them had not originally expected to perform such a complex experiment. Yet the schedule had to continue. Orders were orders. No one imagined they were walking toward one of history's greatest disasters. As midnight approached, operators resumed lowering the reactor's power. Then another problem appeared. Instead of stabilizing at the planned level, the reactor's power suddenly dropped much lower than expected. Far below safe operating conditions. The control room became tense. The operators faced a difficult decision. Should they stop the experiment? Or continue? According to safety procedures, stopping would have been the safest choice. But pressure to complete the long-delayed test weighed heavily on the team. To increase power again, operators withdrew more and more control rods from the reactor. This action helped restore power, but it also placed the reactor in an increasingly unstable condition. Unknown to many inside the control room, they were slowly removing the very safety margins designed to protect them. Warning systems signaled that operating limits were being exceeded. Some alarms were ignored, others were disabled. The experiment continued. Outside, Pripyat slept peacefully. Children rested in their beds. Streetlights illuminated empty roads. Couples watched television before going to sleep. Not a single person in the city realized that, beneath the concrete walls of Reactor No. 4, the reactor was becoming more unstable with every passing minute. And within the next hour, one decision would unleash a catastrophe that would change the world forever. Part 2: The explosion. The clock moved slowly toward 1:23 a.m. inside Reactor No. 4. Tension filled the control room. The operators had spent hours trying to prepare the reactor for the safety test. Nothing had gone according to plan. The reactor had fallen to dangerously low power, control rods had been withdrawn far beyond normal operating limits, and several automatic safety systems had been disabled to prevent the test from being interrupted. Despite these warning signs, the experiment continued. No one in the room believed the reactor could explode. The RBMK design was considered so powerful that many engineers believed such an accident was simply impossible. That belief would prove fatal. Outside, Pripyat was silent. Streetlights reflected off the empty roads. Apartment windows were dark. The city slept peacefully, unaware that only a few kilometers away, history was about to change forever. Inside the control room, the chief engineer gave the order. Begin the test. Steam to the turbines was shut off. The giant turbines continued spinning using their remaining momentum, just as engineers expected. For a few brief seconds, everything appeared normal. Then the reactor began behaving in a way few operators had ever seen. Power levels started rising unexpectedly. The increase was small at first. Then faster. Then uncontrollably. The operators realized something was wrong. Readings on the control panels changed rapidly. Alarms filled the room, one after another. Red warning lights flashed across the consoles. The reactor was becoming unstable. The shift supervisor immediately ordered an emergency shutdown. One operator pressed the AS5 button. This was supposed to be the final safety system. Once activated, every control rod would enter the reactor, slowing the nuclear reaction and bringing the reactor safely to a stop. For years, operators had trusted this system. But hidden inside the RBMK design was a critical flaw. The tips of the control rods were made of graphite. Instead of immediately reducing the nuclear reaction, they briefly increased it during the first moments of insertion. Normally, this effect was insignificant. But under the unstable conditions inside Reactor No. 4, it became catastrophic. Within seconds, reactor power surged to levels no instrument had ever been designed to measure. Some experts later estimated the power output reached more than 100 times the reactor's normal operating level. Fuel channels ruptured. Pressure exploded inside the reactor core. At 1:11:40 p.m., the first explosion tore through Reactor No. 4. The blast lifted the enormous biological shield, a steel and concrete structure weighing nearly 2,000 tons. Moments later, a second, even more powerful explosion ripped through the building. Concrete shattered, steel twisted, the roof collapsed. Pieces of burning graphite and radioactive fuel were thrown high into the night sky. The reactor was no longer contained. Its radioactive core was now exposed directly to the atmosphere. For the first time in history, a commercial nuclear reactor had exploded in the open air. Workers across the station were knocked to the floor. Windows shattered throughout the complex. Dust filled the corridors. The lights flickered. Some electrical systems failed instantly. For several seconds, no one fully understood what had happened. Many believed a hydrogen tank had exploded. Others thought part of the turbine hall had collapsed. The idea that the reactor itself had exploded seemed impossible. It can't happen. That was the assumption repeated by several engineers. The reactor was supposed to be indestructible. But when workers looked outside, they saw something unimaginable. Reactor number 4 was on fire. A bright blue glow rose into the night sky. Chunks of burning graphite lay scattered across the roof and surrounding buildings. Few people recognized what they were seeing. Many unknowingly walked directly toward intensely radioactive debris. Each step exposed them to radiation levels that would soon become fatal. One of the first men to arrive outside was plant operator Alexander Yuvchenko. He had been thrown by the blast but survived. As he rushed toward the damaged reactor building to help his colleagues, he unknowingly passed through areas where radiation levels were extraordinarily high. Like many others that night, he had no idea the invisible danger surrounding him was far more deadly than the flames. Inside the damaged building, several workers searched desperately for missing coworkers. Some entered corridors filled with radioactive steam. Others climbed staircases surrounded by debris and smoke. Many received lethal doses of radiation within minutes. Yet they continued trying to save lives. Within moments, emergency calls reached the local fire station. The message sounded routine. A fire had broken out at the power plant. The firefighters had no reason to believe this call was different from any other. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik quickly gathered his crew. Young firefighters climbed into their engines. Many were in their 20s. Some had wives. Some had small children. None were given protective suits against radiation. None carried dosimeters capable of measuring the enormous radiation levels at the scene. They believed they were responding to an ordinary industrial fire. Instead, they were driving into one of the most dangerous environments ever created by human technology. As the fire engines approached the station, the firefighters immediately saw flames spreading across the roofs. Burning pieces of graphite continued falling around them. The air smelled strange. Some later described it as metallic. Others remembered an unusual taste in their mouths. Still, they climbed ladders. They dragged heavy hoses across burning rooftops. Water sprayed toward the flames. No one told them that water could not extinguish the burning reactor core itself. Their mission was to stop the surrounding fires before they spread to the other reactor buildings. Every minute mattered. Had the flames reached additional reactors or critical equipment, the disaster could have become even worse. Within less than an hour, many firefighters began experiencing unusual symptoms. Headaches, nausea, vomiting, extreme weakness. Some felt as if their skin had been severely sunburned. Others noticed a metallic taste that refused to disappear. Few understood these were the first signs of acute radiation syndrome. They believed exhaustion and smoke were making them sick. So they continued working, for hours, standing only meters away from an exposed nuclear reactor, receiving radiation doses that no human body was designed to survive. While the battle against the fire continued, confusion spread among Soviet officials. Information reaching Moscow was incomplete. Some reports claimed the reactor remained intact. Others suggested only a small explosion had occurred. No one wanted to deliver bad news. Inside the Soviet system, admitting a disaster of this magnitude could destroy careers. As precious hours passed, millions of radioactive particles continued rising into the atmosphere. The invisible cloud drifted north and west with the wind, crossing forests, rivers, farmland, and eventually national borders. The world had not yet realized it, but radioactive contamination was already spreading across Europe. Part 3: The City That Never Woke Up Again. As dawn broke over northern Ukraine, the fires at Reactor No. 4 were finally beginning to come under control. The flames on nearby buildings had been extinguished, but the reactor itself was still burning. Deep inside the exposed core, temperatures remained dangerously high. Radioactive particles continued rising into the atmosphere, carried by the wind across forests, rivers, and villages. Yet in the nearby city of Pripyat, life continued almost as if nothing had happened. Children woke up and prepared for a Saturday morning. Parents opened their windows to let in the fresh spring air. People walked their dogs. Buses followed their usual routes. Some residents noticed an unusual smell. Others saw a strange glow above the power plant during the night. Many stood on bridges overlooking the station, watching smoke rise into the morning sky. They had unknowingly gathered in one of the most radioactive places in the city. Years later, that location would become known as the Bridge of Death. Whether every story about the bridge is accurate remains debated by historians, but one fact is certain. Many people who watched the fire that night received significant doses of radiation without realizing it. Invisible particles settled onto their clothes, their hair, their skin. The danger had no color, no smell, no warning. Inside the power plant, medical teams struggled to understand what they were seeing. Workers arrived with severe burns unlike anything doctors expected. Some had skin that appeared normal at first but soon turned red and swollen. Others vomited repeatedly. Many complained of an intense metallic taste in their mouths. Several firefighters collapsed only hours after battling the blaze. Doctors initially suspected chemical poisoning or smoke inhalation. But as more patients arrived, it became clear that something far more serious had happened. They were suffering from acute radiation syndrome. For many of them, there was little medicine could do. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities faced a difficult decision. Should they evacuate Pripyat? Admitting the scale of the disaster could cause panic and embarrassment for the government. For hours, officials debated what to do. Radiation levels continued rising. Military specialists arrived with more advanced measuring equipment. Some instruments reached their maximum reading almost immediately. Others failed completely because the radiation was too intense. The true levels were far higher than anyone had imagined. Finally, nearly 36 hours after the explosion, the decision was made. The city had to be evacuated. On the afternoon of April 27, 1986, hundreds of buses arrived from across the region. Residents watched in confusion as long columns of vehicles entered Pripyat. Few understood why. Then loudspeakers throughout the city announced the evacuation. The message was calm. Officials told residents they would be away for only a short time. They were instructed to bring identification, important documents, some food, and enough clothing for a few days. Nothing more. Many locked their apartment doors. Some left meals on the kitchen table. Children left toys in their bedrooms. Pets remained inside homes, waiting for owners who would never return. Within just a few hours, nearly 50,000 people left the city. Most believed they would be back in 3 days. They never were. Pripyat became a frozen moment in time. A city abandoned almost overnight. As evacuation buses drove away, another battle was just beginning. Military commanders realized the reactor continued releasing enormous amounts of radioactive material. If the fire inside the core continued, the consequences could become even worse. Helicopter crews received extraordinary orders. They were instructed to fly directly over the burning reactor. Their mission was to drop thousands of tons of sand, boron, clay, and lead into the exposed core. The goal was to smother the fire and reduce radioactive emissions. Every flight carried incredible risk. Pilots flew through invisible clouds of radiation while navigating intense heat rising from the destroyed reactor. Some helicopters passed only a few dozen meters above the opening. Visibility was poor. The heat created unstable air currents. Despite the danger, flight after flight continued. Thousands of tons of material were dropped over the following days. Each mission demanded extraordinary courage. Below the reactor, another terrifying threat emerged. Large amounts of water remained trapped beneath the damaged core. Scientists feared that if the molten nuclear fuel reached these flooded chambers, it could trigger a massive steam explosion. Such an explosion might destroy the remaining reactors and spread even greater radioactive contamination across Europe. A desperate plan was created. Someone had to enter the flooded basement. They needed to locate and open drainage valves before it was too late. The mission appeared almost suicidal. 3 volunteers stepped forward. Working in darkness, surrounded by radioactive water, they searched for the valves using flashlights. The corridors were flooded. Debris blocked their path. Every minute increased their exposure. Finally, after an exhausting search, they found the valves and opened them. Water began draining away. Their actions removed one of the greatest immediate threats following the disaster. Today, historians continue to discuss exactly how much danger the water posed, but there is broad agreement that these workers displayed remarkable bravery under extraordinary circumstances. Even after the fires were controlled, another problem remained. The reactor roof was covered with highly radioactive debris. Modern robots were brought in to clear it. Many had been designed for military use. But the radiation was so intense that electronics quickly failed. Some robots stopped moving within minutes. Others simply shut down forever. Machines could not complete the job. Human beings would have to replace them. Thousands of soldiers and workers were assigned one of the most dangerous tasks of the entire cleanup operation. Because they were replacing failed machines, they became known as bio-robots. Each worker was allowed only a very short time on the roof. Often less than 2 minutes. They ran across the shattered concrete, grabbed pieces of radioactive graphite with shovels, and threw them back into the destroyed reactor. Then they immediately ran back. The work was repeated again and again by thousands of different people, each sacrificing part of their own safety to reduce the danger for everyone else. Across the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of men and women would eventually become known as the liquidators. Soldiers, engineers, doctors, miners, construction workers, scientists, pilots, firefighters. Together, they carried out one of the largest emergency operations in human history. Many dug tunnels beneath the reactor. Others decontaminated villages. Some buried contaminated vehicles. Entire forests were cut down. Buildings were washed repeatedly. Roads were removed. Topsoil was scraped away. Everything touched by dangerous levels of radiation had to be isolated or destroyed. It was a battle unlike any war. There was no visible enemy. No gunfire. No explosions. Only an invisible force that could not be seen, heard, or smelled. And yet it remained deadly. As spring turned into summer, one question remained unanswered. How could the destroyed reactor be sealed forever? The answer would require one of the greatest engineering projects ever attempted. Part 4: The Legacy of Chernobyl. The world had never faced a disaster like this before. Reactor No. 4 no longer existed as a functioning nuclear reactor. Instead, it had become a massive source of radioactive contamination, continuously threatening the people working around it. Every day, engineers searched for a permanent solution. Time was running out. The exposed reactor could not be left uncovered. Wind carried radioactive dust into the air. Rain threatened to spread contamination even further. The Soviet government ordered the construction of an enormous protective structure. It would later become known simply as the Sarcophagus. Building it was unlike any construction project in history. Workers operated in areas where radiation levels were still dangerously high. Many could remain in certain locations for only a few minutes before being replaced. Heavy machinery performed as much work as possible, but human labor remained essential. Thousands of engineers, welders, crane operators, and soldiers worked around the clock. Every bolt, every steel beam, every concrete wall had to be placed under conditions unlike anywhere else on Earth. Against extraordinary odds, the structure was completed in just a few months. It surrounded the destroyed reactor, reducing the release of radioactive material into the environment. But everyone understood one thing. The sarcophagus was never meant to last forever. It was an emergency solution, a race against time. While construction continued, another tragedy unfolded far from the reactor itself. Families across the region searched for answers. Many had left their homes carrying only a few personal belongings. Entire villages disappeared from the map. Schools closed forever. Hospitals were abandoned. Parks became overgrown with trees. Children never returned to their classrooms. Wedding photographs remained hanging on apartment walls. Dinner tables stayed exactly as they had been left. Pripyat became a city frozen in time. Nature slowly reclaimed the streets. Trees pushed through cracked pavement. Vines covered apartment buildings. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, scheduled to open just days after the explosion, never welcomed a single visitor. Today, it stands as one of the most recognizable symbols of Chernobyl. The radioactive cloud did not stop at the borders of the Soviet Union. Within days, radioactive particles were detected in Sweden. Scientists there realized the contamination had come from somewhere else. Only then did the world begin to understand that a major nuclear accident had occurred. International pressure forced Soviet authorities to publicly acknowledge the disaster. It was one of the first moments when the secrecy surrounding the Soviet system was challenged on a global stage. Many historians believe Chernobyl damaged public trust in the Soviet government and became one of the events that contributed to the political changes leading up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union just a few years later. The human cost of Chernobyl is difficult to measure. 2 workers died during the explosion itself. In the weeks that followed, many firefighters and plant personnel died from acute radiation syndrome after receiving extremely high doses while responding to the accident. Over the years, scientists have continued to study the long-term health effects. Some people developed illnesses linked to radiation exposure. Others lived long and healthy lives despite fears of contamination. Because radiation exposure varied greatly from person to person, estimating the total long-term impact remains complex, and different scientific organizations have reached different conclusions. What is beyond debate is that hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes, and entire communities were permanently displaced. The emotional and social consequences continue to be felt decades later. Yet amid the tragedy, stories of extraordinary courage emerge. The firefighters who climbed burning rooftops without knowing the danger they faced. The doctors who treated patients despite limited knowledge of radiation injuries. The helicopter crews who flew above the exposed reactor. The engineers who designed emergency solutions under impossible conditions. The miners who dug beneath the reactor. The soldiers and workers who cleared radioactive debris by hand. Together, these people became known as the liquidators. Many of them never considered themselves heroes. They simply believed they were doing their duty. Without their sacrifice, experts believe the consequences of the disaster could have been far worse. Their courage helped prevent an already unimaginable catastrophe from becoming even greater. More than 30 years after the explosion, another engineering achievement changed the skyline of Chernobyl. An enormous steel structure called the new safe confinement was constructed beside the old reactor. Weighing more than 36,000 tons, it was one of the largest movable structures ever built. Engineers slowly slid it into place over the original sarcophagus. Its purpose was to safely contain the destroyed reactor for decades while allowing future dismantling work to continue. It stands as a reminder that even generations later, the work of managing the consequences of Chernobyl is not yet finished. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains one of the most unusual places on Earth. Most people no longer live there permanently. Buildings slowly decay. Classrooms remain filled with dusty books. Children's toys lie untouched. Trees grow through abandoned apartments. Wildlife has returned to many parts of the zone. Wolves, deer, wild horses, foxes, lynxes, and countless other species now roam landscapes once filled with people. Nature has reclaimed a city that human beings were forced to leave behind. It is both haunting and strangely beautiful. Chernobyl changed the world. It transformed how nations think about nuclear safety. It led to major changes in reactor design, emergency planning, and international cooperation. The disaster reminded humanity that even our greatest technological achievements demand humility, responsibility, and constant vigilance. One mistake, one flawed design, one series of decisions. That was all it took to change history. Final closing. Nearly 4 decades have passed since the explosion at Reactor No. 4. The streets of Pripyat remain silent. The Ferris wheel still stands. Schools remain empty. Apartment windows stare out over a city that never truly woke up again. For millions of people, Chernobyl is more than a place. It is a warning, a reminder of the cost of secrecy, of overconfidence, and of the incredible courage ordinary people can show when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The disaster did not define humanity by its failure alone. It also revealed the bravery of those who chose to step toward danger so that others could live. Because while Chernobyl is remembered as one of history's greatest technological disasters, it is also remembered as one of history's greatest stories of human sacrifice, resilience, and hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more stories that changed our world, don't forget to subscribe to Battle Chronicles. Until next time.